So I'd like to begin today with a subject that has long occupied scholars of ancient Greek medicine, and indeed all of those who study its long and diasporic reception over more than 2,000 years, the subject of contagion. The problem with the study of contagion in Greco-Roman antiquity isn't that we don't have evidence that ancient Greeks recognized the phenomenon that we call contagion. Whenever the topic comes up, and it came up a lot, of course, in the very recent past when the COVID-19 pandemic was raging out of control, the first place that people look is Thucydides' account of the Athenian plague in the second book of his history of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides' account famously comes on the heels of his rendering of Pericles' funeral oration with its fulsome glorification of Athens. He expresses skepticism about all the causes put forth for the plague and instead focuses on recording the disease's symptoms in detail, for as he declares, I myself had the disease and I saw others suffering from it. The account he proceeds to offer clearly observes that people caught the disease by being in close proximity to one another. In fact, he reports mortality among the doctors was highest of all, since they came more frequently in contact with the sick. The medical art thus failed, the techne. It's the doctor's inability to understand or treat the plague that points to the reason why contagion is such a problem for the study of ancient Greek medicine. Namely, ancient medical writers don't seem to talk much about the phenomenon that we call contagion. So did they even have a word for it? This question paraphrases the title of a characteristically thoughtful and erudite essay by Vivian Nutten published in 2000. Did the Greeks have a word for it, contagion, and contagion theory in classical antiquity? Nutten's answer is not exactly no. Rather, he draws attention to the fact that while in Latin, the nouns contagio and contagium, along with related verbs and adjectives, are often used in contexts where the English word contagion would work, there's no single Greek word that is used so often and with such a specific application to disease as contagio. In general, he continues, the Greeks preferred to use such words as share, pass, and receive, which emphasize the common illness rather than a particular mode of transmission, end quote. The question would then become why the Greeks, and especially writers working in the learned tradition of naturalizing medicine, didn't have a standard word for contagion, and here much speculation abounds. Some scholars have argued that the idea of contagion veered too closely to magical religious ideas about miasma to be easily accommodated within the aetiological paradigm of Hippocratic medicine, with its sidelining of divine and daimonic agents of disease in favor of natures. Nutten suggests that the concept of contagion was especially suited to mechanistic and/or atomistic physics, a position that he had first developed in his classic 1983 article published in Medical History entitled The Seeds of Disease. Atomism, after all, it was the minoritarian physics of ancient Greek medicine, philosophy, and science, as Nutten emphasizes. And on the natural faculties, the most important Greek medical writer and physician, Galen of Pergamum, speaks of two sects of philosophy and medicine. These could be summed up as atomists against everyone else. And of course, Galen is on the side of the continuum theorists. So we'll come back to this question of the atomists below, if that's a good explanation for thinking about why contagion isn't in Galen and elsewhere. But however you look at it, it seems to be the case that the phenomenon of contagion was a puzzle in ancient medicine. In fact, to be more specific, contagion could be seen as a problem, a problema in the ancient medical tradition. The idea of problems helped generate a genre of writing in natural philosophy and medicine that seems to have taken off with the Peripatetics in the later 4th century BCE. But it was probably already underway in earlier Greek medical writing, and it goes on to a long and flourishing afterlife in the Roman imperial period and the centuries that follow. Our earliest extant work from the genre is a Problems in 38 books attributed to Aristotle. Now, modern scholars would virtually all agree that Aristotle isn't responsible for the work, or at least for the whole work, but the problems do probably reflect the work of Theophrastus and his successors and later Peripatetic compilers, which are woven together in a fluid process of accretion, rearrangement, and rewriting beginning sometime in the 4th century BCE. So what is a problem? In Greek, a problema is literally an obstacle, something thrown in front of your path. The problems in question have to do with physis, that is, with nature. But even as they locate themselves in what could be called by at least the early 4th century BCE, the inquiry into nature, they also challenge the explanatory resources of nature. In short, then, the phenomena that land in the problems are widely recognized facts that nevertheless defy the ability of the naturalist, the physicos, to explain them. So it's therefore telling that the phenomenon we call contagion lands in the 7th book of the Pseudo-Aristotelian Problems, which has been labeled a book on the contagious by Robert Mayhew in his recent Loeb edition. Indeed, Nutten cites the Problems as the earliest text where we see learned physicians and philosophers grappling with why certain diseases are easy to catch, that is, phthisis, scabies, and a class of eye diseases that are referred to as ophthalmia in Greek, ophthalmia or lipitudo in Latin. So at some unknown and probably unknowable point in the text's transmission, someone labeled this book Problems from Sympathy, Sahosek Sympatheias, although the word sympatheia doesn't appear in the body of the text. So it's interesting that the Greek noun sympatheia is not a word that Nutten considers as a viable Greek counterpart to the Latin contagio, or our word contagion for that matter. Whereas Nutten himself showed the turning point in modern conceptions of contagion is Fracastro's 1546 text, De Contagione, which is the first book of a treatise on sympathy and antipathy, the sympatheia et antipatheia. Fracastro then embedded contagion within the larger concepts of sympathy and antipathy. Moreover, his interest in sympathy and antipathy must be read within the learned reception of ancient Greek philosophy and science in the early modern period, on which Anne Moyer has written recently. The overlap, in fact, between sympatheia, the Latin word contagio, and our idea of contagion is not only an early modern phenomenon. There's good evidence that contagio was, in fact, one of the words that Latin authors used to translate the Greek word sympatheia, especially Latin authors who are especially self-conscious about the translation of technical, philosophical, and medical terms from Greek into Latin. So Cicero and Lucretius, for example, in the 1st century BCE, Caelius Aurelianus writing much later in the 4th century CE. Time constraints keep me from going into the evidence here, but we can see that in these cases, Latin authors are self-consciously engaging with technical senses as sympatheia coming out of Stoic cosmology, for example, as well as out of Epicurean psychology and technical medical writing. But the fact that the Greek problems tradition from early on filed paradigmatic contagious disease as problems of sympathy, sympatheia, is to my mind especially compelling evidence for paying closer attention to sympatheia in relation to the contagious. One of the claims of this talk, then, is that the history of sympathy is integral to the history of what we understand as contagion in ways that have not been fully appreciated. But I'll defend this claim today not by offering you a full overview of either the history of contagion or ancient sympatheia, or trying to show that sympatheia is behind every use of contagio in Latin. Rather, I'll spend most of my time with a section from Galen's text on problematical movements. And I attend closely to this passage in my talk today because I think it can help us get a better understanding, first, of why what I'll call contagious affect was a problem for ancient Greek medical writers, and second, how framing it in terms of sympatheia could situate it in relationship to other areas of speculation about shared or contagious affect in the Greek medical and philosophical tradition. But first, I need to offer a bit more context for the history of sympathy that will shed light on what we see in Galen. So for over a decade, I've been working on a study of what I call the conceptual field of sympatheia in the ancient Mediterranean from the 4th century BCE, when the language first emerges in our written record, to the writings of the Neoplatonist Plotinus in the 3rd century CE. Now, I'm not going to speak at length about the project today, but there are a couple arguments that I develop there that are relevant to getting closer to what Galen is doing. The first of these is that we should think of sympatheia not as a single unified concept, but rather as what I call a conceptual field. And doing so can help us pay attention to different strands of a concept of sympatheia that emerge early within the inquiry into nature in response to specific problems and questions. These strands gain in complexity as they're taken up within specific generic traditions, say philosophical psychology or learned medicine or cosmology. The second important point is that ancient sympathy is much more expansive than the modern idea of moral sympathy. It does encompass the sharing of affects, pathé, among members of the same kind, including among human beings, but that's not its only sense. Finally, if you do know anything about pre-modern sympathy, you probably assume that it is sympathy and antipathy. And indeed, antipathy does become very closely interwoven with antipathy within the reception of sympathy. So we can think back to Frockströ's text, which is on sympathy and antipathy. But on closer examination of the ancient evidence, it's clear that sympathy-antipathy is only one strand of sympathy, albeit one that becomes increasingly important over the first few centuries CE, and one that will be notable in grounding rhetorical claims to non-Greek authority over nature. But in many contexts, sympatheia works on its own without antipathy. Now, the earliest instances of the language of sympathy point to the sharing of affects or affections between human beings. But again, as I said, we should be cautious about reading a modern notion of sympathy into these examples. So the earliest case of the verb sympaskein occurs in Plato's Charmides to describe a case of what we might call contagious yawning. And it so happens that contagious yawning, as we'll see below, is the first problem that appears in book 7 of the Pseudo-Aristotelian Problems, which is the book that contains the contagious diseases that I earlier mentioned, so phthisis, eye disease, and scabies. That book also raises another question about contagion. Why do those who get too close get sick from certain diseases, whereas no one becomes healthy from health? So here then we start to see the evidence for a concept of sympatheia that we could call contagious affect, and that seems to have been codified in a peripatetic context, although apparently with Platonic and perhaps earlier medical influences. And this idea of sympatheia as contagious affect will be important to our analysis of the passage from Galen in Unproblematical Movements. But before turning to Galen, let me just reiterate again that ancient sympathy is not a monolith of magical thinking. It's not even one concept in the ancient Mediterranean. It's a dynamic conceptual field within the inquiry into nature where different strands of sympathy emerge from the 4th century BCE onwards. And they emerge in particular at places where ancient thinkers are grappling with the idea of how natural bodies and their parts relate to each other such that they regularly share affects. Now, Galen, as I've shown elsewhere, experiments with different strands of sympatheia in his writings. In particular, as I'll mention below, he develops a technical theory of sympatheia as the transfer of affect between different parts of the body that may be relevant to the passage from Unproblematical Movements that we'll discuss. But this passage will also lead us to other strands of sympathy that are not taken up by Galen elsewhere in his extant writings, namely sympatheia qua contagion, as well as another sympatheia, that between the body and the soul. So let me then at this point give a more specific version of the argument that I'm going to make in the remainder of this paper. Galen, I suggest, is a witness to the ongoing importance in the 1st century CE of the genre of problems to speculation about contagious disease in ancient Greek medicine in philosophy in terms of sympatheia qua contagious affect. But the very status of this genre as problematic should prepare us for an engagement with sympatheia in Galen that is far from straightforward. Rather, as we'll see, questions about contagion come up almost offhandedly by way of one of the 3 standard contagious diseases, eye disease. Galen's attempts to understand how eye disease is transmitted in this case opens on to speculation about other phenomena that were referred to sympatheia in the problems literature, such as contagious yawning. I show that Galen tackles the standard problem of sympatheia qua contagious affect by shifting his attention away from the transmission of affect between bodies towards the main zone that occupies him in this treatise, namely the relationship between the mind, understood primarily as the locus of voluntary action, and the body, or nature. He effects this shift, as we'll see, through a strategic invocation of Hippocrates. Once he's turned contagious affect into a problem within the boundaries of the living being or the animal, he can approach it as another case of puzzling movements in the body. By the time this process is complete, he can in fact frame eye disease as a disease that is just as likely to arise from imagining a diseased eye as it is from encountering someone who has an eye infection. So what I hope to show then is how Galen's discussion offers additional evidence for the significance of the problem of contagion understood as sympatheia in Greek traditions of natural philosophy, science, and medicine. I hope to show too how the language of sympathy facilitates Galen's redefinition of the problem of contagious affect in terms of the relation between the mind and that part of the self he designates as natural, that is to say, under the causal regime of nature. And here I suggest we can see from another angle how contagion posed a problem to the explanatory resources of Greek medicine. For what couldn't be easily explained couldn't be easily controlled. It's true that problematical movements themselves continue to pose difficulties for Galen, but the point of his treatise is to lay claim to these movements as at least within the boundaries of his own medical scientific project, and so subject to epistemic control. Nevertheless, in the end, the story I tell here suggests that Galen's attempts to understand the problematical movements related to contagious affect remain open-ended. They thus remind us of the extent to which nature haunts Galen's writings as a problem, a problema. At the same time, reading Galen closely can also defamiliarize contagion, forcing us to think harder about its very boundaries as a transhistorical natural phenomenon. So Galen's short treatise on problematical movements, so in Greek, periton, aporōn, kinēseōn, has experienced a remarkable revival over the past 30 years. Virtually nothing of the treatise survives in Greek. It's been transmitted rather in the 9th century Arabic translation by Hunayn ibn Ishaq and in 2 Latin translations. The first of these by Mark of Toledo in around 1200 was based on Hunayn's Arabic translation and was widely read in subsequent centuries. The second was the work of Niccolò da Reggio in the early 14th century from a Greek manuscript. So Carlos Larrain, who edited Niccolò's Latin text in the early 1990s, deserves credit for bringing the text back into scholarly conversations. But the definitive scholarly work was done by Vivian Nutton and Garrett Boss, working with both the Latin translations and the Arabic one, respectively. And my work in this paper is on all counts indebted to their excellent 2011 edition and Nutton's translation of Niccolò's Latin version of Galen's text. So unproblematical movements is largely a study of movements that trouble the boundary between what is voluntary and what is involuntary. Aristotle had considerable interest in animal motions, and the parameters of voluntary movement started to attract increasing interest from both physicians and philosophers from the Hellenistic period on. On the one hand, there was Herophilus's identification of the nerves as crucial mediators for sense perception and voluntary motion in Ptolemaic Alexandria. On the other hand, the Stoics in particular homed in on questions of volition and intention through their theory of assent. While it's unclear what the relationship was between these developments in medicine and philosophy before Galen, Galen himself takes anatomy as foundational for philosophy. So in unproblematical movements, he's especially interested in movements that are hard to define as either voluntary or involuntary, or as he'll put it, natural. And the nature he refers to here is familiar from his physiological text on the natural faculties, which is a text that he often cross-references in unproblematical movements. Galen's also interested in movements that occur not primarily through the activities of the muscles, but through swells of pneuma. And so the paradigm case for him here are erections, but Galen also offers up our ability to stick our tongues out as a kind of parallel case. He's also interested in movements that are sometimes voluntary and other times involuntary, such as breathing, or in some people, vomiting. And he pays particular attention throughout the text to imagination, fantasia, which will come back in Galen's discussion in chapter 8 of what I've called contagious affect. So let's get into this chapter now. So unproblematical movement stands out among Galen's writings as a text especially given to digressions, as if its style were enacting the aleatory movements of the desires drifting between intentionality and automaticity that so intrigue Galen in the text. Chapter 8 finds Galen engaged in a broad philosophical discussion about volition before narrowing back to the problem that had been troubling him in the chapter before, namely that vomiting, while primarily involuntary, also seems at times to come under the control of the will. Indeed, he makes it clear that the problem has been much discussed by other medical writers, which is why he's included it here. Now, it's at this point that he makes a rather abrupt pivot to eye disease as a not inappropriate detour. So if you look at someone with eye disease, ophthalmia, he says, the eyes fill with moisture. If you look a long time, you'll catch the disease as if the eye's essential power is weakened so that they receive impressions from the person next to them suffering the eye disease. Galen, that is, suggests that the eyes become vulnerable through extended looking at another infected eye, while also pinpointing impressions as a vector of the disease. He thus seems to be wading into the territory of one of the paradigmatic contagious diseases that had traveled in the problem genre under the aegis of sympatheia. There are additional clues that Galen has the physical problem of contagious affect in mind when he undertakes this digression. So shortly after turning to eye disease, he introduces the problem of contagious yawning and the related problem of contagious urination, which ancient authors attributed to pack animals in general. So earlier we saw that these problems clustered in book 7 of the Book of Problems from Sympathy in the Pseudo-Aristotelian problems. And remember too that contagious yawning occasions the very first extant instance of the verb sympaskein in Plato's Charmides. Well, it's true that we don't know when the title, Problems from Sympathy, was added to the Pseudo-Aristotelian book. But another influential problems text, probably written and or compiled in the 2nd or 3rd century CE, does use sympatheia as a strategy for making sense of what I've been calling the problem of contagious affect. The text in question is the medical puzzles and physical problems attributed to the Aristotelian commentator and younger contemporary of Galen, Alexander of Aphrodisias, though it's unlikely to be by the famed commentator. The first book returns us to the cluster of problems from sympathy that are familiar from the Pseudo-Aristotelian problems: contagious yawning and urination, infectious eye disease. So here, the author first proposes the problem of contagious yawning before declaring that the nature of animals is homeopathic and sympathizes. And he goes on to specify that sympathy is greater among irrational animals and offers, by way of example, contagious urination among donkeys. That phenomenon is also mentioned in the Pseudo-Aristotelian problems. In the next chapter, the author asks, why is eye disease contagious, but health is not? So combining two problems from the Aristotelian book. Moreover, he'll go on, health can be readily disrupted. He therefore suggests a relationship between affectability in general and pathology. And he concludes by ascribing this propensity toward imbalance to the natural sympathy of bodies. So diatein physikein ton somaton sympatheion. So the author thus positions patheia, or sympathizing, sympaskein, on the one hand as a sort of relation between animals with common nature that enables them to share affects. On the other hand, the natural sympathy of bodies points us toward an instability in these bodies that makes it easy for affects to travel between them. This means that it's because the eyes, being soft and moist, are especially affectable, that eye diseases are unusually contagious. Galen seems to have something similar in mind when he suggests that the eyes receive impressions from looking at someone else once they've been weakened and moistened over time. But if Galen's explanation of eye disease starts to converge with what we find in the Pseudo-Alexandrian problems, it then makes another seemingly abrupt shift by way of an invocation of Hippocrates. And so I'll quote here from Nutton's translation of the Latin translation of Niccolo. Hippocrates declared that sympathetic affections, in the Latin here as compassiones, can be similarly passed on to the body. Galen goes on to cite a passage from the Hippocratic text on humors, in which the sudden appearance of a serpent brings about pallor, one's legs shape beside a precipice, and one's hands tremble when those in fear want to do something with them. With this citation of on humors, Galen thus makes a crucial pivot away from the sympathetic transmission of affect between two bodies and eye disease towards the similarly sympathetic transmission of affect between the mind and the body. Nutton assumes that the Greek term behind the Latin compassio is sympatheia, and there are good grounds for thinking he's correct based on Galen's use of sympatheia elsewhere. So let's take a quick look at this evidence before considering how sympatheia enables Galen to pivot as he does. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Galen uses sympatheia as a technical term to refer to affects that are transmitted from one part of the body to another. The theory is especially developed in the treatise on the affected parts, where Galen distinguishes most systematically between affections that are idiopathic, that is proper and original to the part where they're found, and those that occur according to sympathy. He also develops a loose taxonomy of these translocal sympathies according to how they travel through the body. In some cases, an affect's transmitted via humors. It can be transmitted via vapors. In other cases, a part can't function because the psychic nym is blocked, a condition that he in fact invokes again at the beginning of unproblematical movements. So very commonly, affects travel through the networks of veins, arteries, and nerves that the Hellenistic anatomists had begun to map in earnest. In fact, Galen trumpets his own skill in diagnosing sympathetic affections thanks to his deep anatomical expertise. Knowledge of sympatheia bolsters Galen's broader self-presentation then as an anatomist, a clinician, and a medical detective. Galen's claims on sympathy led Rudolf Siegel to propose that Galen had invented the theory of sympathetic affections. But Galen himself attributes knowledge of sympathies among the body's parts to Hippocrates himself, much as he takes the Hippocrates of On Humors to have a concept of soul-body sympatheia. As I've shown elsewhere, Galen reads the noun sympatheia into the texts of Hippocrates in his commentaries on various Hippocratic texts, despite the fact that the language of sympathy appears nowhere in the classical era texts of the Hippocratic corpus. It's true that affects do travel between parts in many Hippocratic texts, and several authors do recognize a kinship or a community, a koinonia between specific parts as the breasts and the uterus. And indeed, in his commentaries, these are places where Galen himself might see sympatheia. But it's most likely that the origins of sympatheia as a technical diagnostic concept in Greek medical writings lie somewhere in between the Hippocratic writers and Galen, and they belong to that larger history of the elaboration of sympathy as a conceptual field. Though we cannot pinpoint exactly when a technical or diagnostic sense of translocal sympathy emerged, it probably became established in tandem with the rise of interest in the affected parts in the first centuries CE. So Cyrenus of Ephesus, who's working a bit earlier than Galen, uses this language to talk about translocal transmission of affect, and Galen himself will refer to it as a concept in circulation among even his rivals. So On the Affected Parts, he suggests Archigenes had a theory of sympathetic affections. So in short, though, medical writing in the 2nd century CE seemed to widely recognize the idea of affects shared among different body parts. So in the passage from On Problematical Movements, Galen looks like he's adopting a familiar strategy in attributing an understanding of sympatheia in the body to Hippocrates. Moreover, as I suggested earlier, he does this in order to shift attention from the sympathy between one eye and another, that is the scene of familiar sympathy from the problemata tradition, to sympatheia within the ensouled body. Now, what makes this shift possible, I suggest, is the very status of sympatheia as a conceptual field, which is woven out of different strands that can nevertheless create points of passage between them, precisely through their interweaving on a conceptual field that crosses generic boundaries within traditions of philosophy, science, and medicine organized around nature. That is, it is something of a technical concept that's been codified in both the genre of physical problems as contagious affect and in learned medical writing of the 1st century CE as something like translocal affect. Maybe it's codified earlier, we can't quite tell. But because of this, these codifications, the word sympatheia can work as a portal between these two contexts, taking us from one scene of sympathy to another. And we could speculate further that the function of sympatheia as a portal is particularly valuable to Galen because it enables him to transpose the puzzling phenomenon of contagion into the terrain of the body that he knows so well. Now, in fact, the strategy of shifting attention to the body itself is visible elsewhere when Galen confronts the phenomenon of contagious diseases. And here it's worth turning back to Nutton's 1983 article, The Seeds of Disease. Galen sometimes points to polluted air as a vector of plague, adopting an explanatory strategy that's already visible in several Hippocratic texts. Nutton also considers the limited evidence that Galen was willing to recognize the existence of seeds, spermata of disease, and especially plague, at least in a couple treatises written around the same time in the mid-170s CE. So, for example, in the most interesting case, which is on the presentation from On Differences of Fevers, which was probably written around 174, 175 CE, he refers to such seeds in his efforts to explain the Athenian plague described by Thucydides. In another text on antecedent causes, which survives only in the Latin translation of Niccolò da Reggio and was probably written shortly after, On Differences of Fevers, Galen makes a reference to seeds of fevers to explain why only a few spectators in an open-air theater would come down with heat stroke after being out on a very hot day. So here, the seeds of disease seem to sit ambiguously between external and internal cause, and Galen has a complex theory of different causes we can go into in the Q&A. But from this material, Nutton emphasizes it's not possible to reconstruct even a coherent position for Galen on the seeds of disease, let alone a fully fledged theory of contagion. Now, Nutton does excavate traces of a theory of such seeds, starting from the Roman Epicurean Lucretius and working back to sources potentially as early as Democritus and Empedocles. He speculates that such a theory could have been developed by medical theorists such as Asclepiades of Bithynia, whom Galen closely associates with Epicurus for his atomist views and on the natural faculties, but who also came to be closely aligned with the Methodist tradition as part of his origin. And indeed, Nutton surfaces other evidence from Plutarch suggesting that the seeds of disease could have been a Methodist theory. So if the theory indeed had an Epicurean and or a Methodist pedigree, it's easy to see why Galen, who was both virulently anti-atomist and anti-Methodist, would have kept it at arm's length. But maybe more importantly, a theory that looked to seeds of disease had other liabilities for Galen. First, there was little Galen or any other doctor could do about airborne seeds. The problem is evident in the Hippocratic text on the nature of a human being, which recommends, in addition to getting as far away as possible from the places where a disease is entrenched, simply breathing as lightly as possible. But second, as Nutton emphasizes, Galen's theory of disease was overwhelmingly physiological rather than ontological, to use Osway-Tempkins' terms. Galen's main area of attention is the condition of the patient's own body. So in On Differences of Fevers, he speaks about the readiness, the heteroimotes of the body that falls prey to the disease. Galen's focus on this internal condition enables him, on the one hand, to reclaim contagious diseases for medicine insofar as the physician can affect the state of the patient's body. On the other hand, it also allows him to emphasize the individual's own responsibility for getting sick. So for Galen, the assignment of blame here isn't just about faulting people for not going to the doctor. He also likes to moralize about what we might call pre-existing conditions. So in the passage here, we can see the people who are susceptible to the seeds of plague are those who pursue a life of ease dominated by eating, drinking, and sex. In short, then, Galen had various reasons for marginalizing the phenomenon of contagion in his work and focusing on the body. So let's go back then to unproblematical movements. When Galen shifts attention away from eye disease here towards the interior of the patient's body, he looks like he's using a move that can be discerned in other contexts where contagious disease is at play. But it's also the case that in this instance, Galen is reorienting the transmission of affect between two eyes toward a very specific kind of phenomenon within the patient, namely the relationship between the mind or the soul and the body. And it's this relationship that's especially important to the puzzling movements that the text is trying to make sense of. Galen introduces the passage from the Hippocratic On Humors as evidence of sympathies between the mind or soul, implied here as the origin of fear, and the body. And how he understands the mind here is something I'll come back to briefly. But it's first worth emphasizing that sympatheia between the soul and the body was probably one of the earliest strands of sympatheia to emerge on the conceptual field of sympathy, and already in the 4th century BCE. Again, I've argued this point elsewhere, but I'm just going to emphasize a couple of key points. First, the growing importance of a zone of phenomena designated as common to body and soul in Plato, and especially Aristotle, helped set the stage for the emergence of psychosomatic sympatheia in the 4th century BCE. Aristotle only uses the verb sympaskein once of affects that are shared between body and soul in the passage here from prior analytics. But this physiognomic context points to an area where psychosomatic sympatheia gained early traction. So we find the noun in the Peripatetic physiognomy treatise, which is probably from the late 4th or early 3rd century BCE. And one of the paradigmatic affects that was used to prove that body and soul sympathize was the effects of fear on the body, e.g. becoming pale, trembling, etc., the very symptoms that are noted in On Humors. In fact, in another of the Pseudo-Alexandrian problems, the author points to sympatheia to explain why the hands tremble in fear. Now, in the 3rd century BCE, the evidence suggests that both the major Hellenistic philosophical schools, the Stoics and the Epicureans, used the increasingly codified phenomena of body-soul sympathy to argue that the soul is corporeal, for they argued only bodies can affect bodies. So if, as the second head of the Stoics, Cleanthes, had argued, and this is the passage on the screen, the body is affected by the soul in, say, fear, and if in turn the soul is affected by the body, then the soul must be a body. The argument seems to have become widespread in the Hellenistic and Roman imperial periods, and it's targeted by later Aristotelians and Platonists trying to save the soul's incorporeality. The report of Cleanthes' argument, for example, comes from the 4th century CE Christian Platonist Nemesius, who tries to refute it. Alexander of Aphrodisias, as a good Aristotelian, refused to accept that sympathizing entails corporeality, as you can see in the longer passage here. Now, in fact, Galen himself references a version of the argument in the 4th chapter of On Problematical Movements, which is the chapter where he's openly grappling with questions that troubled him throughout his life. One of these is how the demiurgic creator, whom Galen sometimes calls nature, is immanent in bodies as little n nature. A related subject is the relationship of body and soul. So Galen here points to a phenomenon he takes as fact, namely that bodily changes follow the mind's thoughts. By way of example, he says that rigor often seizes those who experience extreme stress, sadness, or fear. For this reason, he continues, some people have argued that the soul is corporeal, although these people can't agree on what it is. Now, Galen continues on to briefly allude to his own view that, quote, a substance in coming into being and passing away is changed in the 4 qualities, hot, cold, dry, and wet. But he also affirms his agnostic position on the corporeality of the soul, saying that he's going to leave it to others to settle this matter. Now, it's worth noticing here that Galen speaks of the body following the mind's thoughts, and this is the language he uses most notably in his treatise that the capacities of the soul follow, so in Greek hepontai, the mixtures of the body. He, in fact, doesn't talk about body, soul, sympatheia, even when the phenomenon comes up in On the Affected Parts, the text where we find the most extensive use of the term sympatheia to describe the transmission of affect. Now, one reason he avoids this language could be precisely the parameters of sympatheia as a technical term and On the Affected Parts to describe the transmission of affect between those parts that are anatomically mappable. Another reason could be Galen's own agnosticism about the soul's corporeality, as I've suggested elsewhere. That is, by the 2nd century CE, claims of soul-body sympathy implied that soul is a body, and Galen seems aware of those debates. He's not sure, though, what he thinks about the corporeality of the soul, and that might explain why he largely avoids positing soul-body sympatheia. So Galen's reticence about soul-body sympathy elsewhere in his corpus makes it all the more interesting that it shows up as a Hippocratic commitment in the passage we saw earlier in chapter 8. Recall that no classical era Hippocratic text talks about sympatheia. Galen introduces this language. I've suggested that he does so in part to facilitate a shift of attention away from the contagious affect between bodies toward the circulation of affect within the body. And yet now this internal circulation of affect isn't going to look like translocal sympathy in other contexts where affects travel along paths within the anatomically mapped body, nor is it quite body or soul, body and soul. The whole problem in unproblematical movements is the difficulty of understanding movements that seem to circumvent somehow the transmission of an impulse from the brain, way center of volition, to a body part via nerves and muscles. So that is, the text is precisely about those movements that implicate a more mysterious space between soul and body. And now, in fact, if we pause for a minute, we might think it's weird to think of eye disease as something produced in the zone between mind and body. And yet this is exactly where Galen's line of thinking will eventually lead us, namely to eye diseases that owe as much to imagination and thought as to an encounter with another eye. So in the last part of the paper, I'm going to take a closer look at how Galen gets to this point. So if we go back to Galen's citation of the Hippocratic on humors, we can see that it in fact mediates between 2 of the paradigmatic problems that had clustered under the heading of sympatheia. So first we had eye disease, and then we come back to contagious, yawning, and urinating. Galen adds defecating and stretching, although interestingly, stretching is not contagious in the pseudo-Aristotelian problems. The last examples are cases where if you see someone doing these things, you'll be prompted to act similarly as if the limbs had a mind of their own. Now, Galen illustrates this phenomenon by turning to another phenomenon that he puzzled over often in his writings, and including he brought up when he was discussing body and soul back in chapter 4 of On Puzzling Movements, or On Problematical Movements. What's remarkable, he thinks, is that when even very small children want to move some part of their body, they're able to do so, even though they have no understanding of the muscles involved. And in fact, this problem isn't limited to children. Even skilled anatomists don't understand how every muscle works. Still, they somehow manage to use their bodies with ease to accomplish what they want to do, even dissecting the body to see the muscles. The very fact of voluntary motion fascinated and troubled Galen because he thought that it undermined a theory of a single or unitary soul. After all, he argued notably and On the Formation of the Fetus, if there's one soul that made the parts and that also uses them, how come our conscious thinking selves are so ignorant about how the muscles work? So we're all of us, not just children, blind to our bodies. But again, this is going to be a problem for all voluntary motion and not only problematical movements. Moreover, Galen doesn't think the limbs actually have a mind of their own. Rather, as he goes on to clarify, they somehow recognize what the mind wants. He therefore concludes that those body parts that seem moved primarily by bursts of pneuma rather than muscles, so the tongue or the penis, can also somehow recognize what the mind wants. So we seem to end up with a model where Hippocratic soul-body sympathy somehow explains all voluntary motion, whether or not it involves the muscles. But it's worth remembering that in the case of fear reported from On Humors, the stimulus of the reaction is external. So you see a snake and you're afraid, or you're on the edge of a cliff and you're afraid. Seeing these things causes the soul to feel fear that is then transmitted to the body. What the passage describes then is something like an affective chain that originates outside the body before ricocheting within it, traversing the boundary between the mind and the body. And this is in fact the structure that Galen then applies to the case of contagious yawning or urinating. We see someone do something and then our limbs respond with an automaticity that causes Galen to say it's as if they have a mind of their own. And we see the same thing in Galen's account of the young children moving their limbs. It's not so much here that they want to move their limbs or their mouth in this case. Rather, the point is that they imitate the words said by adults. Now, in this chapter, Galen adds at this point a familiar observation, even though they have no knowledge of the muscles whose movement of the tongue articulates voice into speech. But it's equally, if not more relevant in this context, that the movement is mimetic. For a mimetic reaction complicates the status of the mind as the origin of the intention, because what the mind wants here is triggered by a chain of affect arising from outside the child, the words of a parent or a teacher, whose speech causes the child to imitate them automatically or naturally, we might say. In the case of contagious yawning or eye disease too, the response is both mimetic and seemingly automatic. This activity of a quasi-automatic mimesis, in fact, looms large in the pseudo-Aristotelian problems. So the author of that text explains contagious eye disease in the passage I've put on the presentation by noting not only that the eye is easily moved, but that it makes itself most like what it sees. In this way, eye disease resembles contagious yawning as much as it resembles other contagious diseases, such as phthisis, which this author attributes to infected air. So earlier I noted that one of the first extant uses of the verb sympathein is from Plato's Charmides. The other is from Book 10 of Plato's Republic, where Socrates uses the verb to describe how spectators in the tragic theater let their rational soul give way to their affective soul and suffer together with the performers on stage. And again, one of the problems from Book 7 of the pseudo-Aristotelian problems is precisely why when we see someone being tortured, we feel pain together with them. Now, this may not look like contagion as we understand it, as a trans-historical natural phenomenon that people in the past either know about or not, but we may gain a richer history of something like contagious affect by paying closer attention to how something we recognize as contagion clusters together with other phenomena in the ancient Greek medical tradition through the language of sympatheia. One of the ways that sympatheia came to matter to these explanations is by describing a relationship of commonality between two natures, literally in this passage from 7.7, a nature held in common. So I get eye disease from another eye. In the case of contagious affect, the similarity is what makes it easy for natural bodies to affect each other mimetically, so I yawn and you yawn. The instability of the ensouled body in the face of particular stimuli looks to be at play in Galen's examples as much as soul-body sympathy. So more specifically, these examples point to stimuli that appear to travel easily from an external source to sense organs, especially the eyes, and then on to the mind and into the body. The susceptibility to being infected by another's eye disease or another's yawn thus goes together with the unusual susceptibility of the body in these cases to being affected by the mind. Now, the mind matters, but the emphasis is on its largely passive receptivity to stimuli. Moreover, the point of movements like yawning or urinating is they seem to be triggered mimetically in a way that seems to bypass deliberation or conscious decision. So if we go back to the pseudo-Aristotelian problems, we find these explanations of contagious yawning, which appears several times in the book. First, the author proposes that when we're reminded of something, when we feel an urge, we act on it, especially with what is easily moved, taiokineta, such as urinating. So he continues, yawning is a breath and a movement of moisture, so it's always at hand if only one thinks about it. A second version of the problem offers a similar explanation, but suggests that the body is also primed to perform the action in response to a memory. The memory is thus what intervenes between seeing someone perform an action and then performing it yourself. That is moving towards the imagined condition. The third time the problem's author mentions the problem of contagious yawning, a few chapters later, he simply points to memory. The mimetic response is thus attributed to how easily memories trigger certain kinds of movements. So here we can loop back to the similarities between the digression in chapter 8 of unproblematical movements and contagion elsewhere in Galen. Galen, we saw, prefers to downplay external triggers in favor of internal states. But here, what matters is not so much the condition of the body, rather it's a gray zone between volition and involuntary or natural movements that intrigues Galen in this text. It's the line, in other words, between what counts as volition and what falls to nature and its faculties. It's this zone that seems to be implicated in those sympathies and ensouled bodies that form a chain of affects, extending beyond those bodies into the world to bodies like them. And this brings us finally to imagination. Now, if I'm only bringing imagination in at the 11th hour, my excuse is that I'm only imitating Galen himself. So in the last stretch of chapter 8, he makes a rather abrupt pivot to something else, ex genere quaestionum. Now, as Nutton notes, this Latin quaestionum may very well conceal a problematon in the Greek. The problem is why inflammations are less painful when we're occupied with other things. The reverse, he continues, also seems to be true. Namely, when we're not distracted, pain often seems worse. The discussion that follows makes it clear that the problem was widely discussed not only by physicians, but also by philosophers. And Galen goes on to give accounts of different philosophical explanations that implicate different theories of the soul. Either the mind here aligned with the ruling part of the soul is distracted by other things, or when the ruling part of the soul is weakened, the other parts of the body are also weakened and so suffer pain more. Galen seems to favor the former explanation as most plausible. So he closes the chapter by extending it back to the problem of eye disease with which this whole digression began, when he suggests that that an eye which is healthy can suffer something itself just from seeing another eye if one then thinks a lot about the affliction. So here then, the external stimulus for the disease of the eye falls out almost entirely. Indeed, the eye disease is caused mostly as a response to the mind's obsessive thoughts about it, through presumably mental imagining. At this point, it seems to matter less that the eye receives an impression from another body and more that the mind dwells on it. For it's the thinking about it that causes the eye to imitate a diseased eye. So Galen's emphasis here on thought and imagination is clearly responsive to established conversations about pain. And his discussion throughout this chapter is undoubtedly informed, too, by ideas about memory and imagination that look now to be endemic to discussions of contagious or sympathetic affect in the problems genre. And these ideas themselves are probably indebted to Aristotle's theory of the imagination, as William Fortenbaugh observed. From this perspective, then, there's perhaps more continuity than had originally appeared between a kind of contagion between animals and contagion within animals, even in the text of the problems. Moreover, already in those texts, sympatheia may be helping to bridge these zones of contagious affect. So if Galen's invocation of sympatheia reflects this kind of bridging work already in the problems tradition, it may give us a bit more insight into how the conceptual field of sympathy shaped discussion of contagious affect between animals and with it contagious diseases by relating it to the circulation of affect within animals. But at the same time, I'd suggest that by using a self-consciously Hippocratic sympatheia to shift attention into the animal body, Galen situates contagious affect as a problem aligned with the concerns that occupy him, especially in unproblematical movements, but also in treatises like On the Natural Faculties or On the Formation of the Fetus. Most notable in this text is the gap between what we choose to do and what nature does automatically, and what this difference tells us about the soul, its relationship to the body, and the relationship between the nature within us and providential nature. From this angle, memory and imagination take on particular importance, for they become alternative origin sites alongside external stimuli for the mental affects that travel most sympathetically into the body and trigger movements that, while officially on the side of volition, approach the natural faculties. In unproblematical movements, imagination appears with the very first mention of erections, which is the case that Galen returns to repeatedly in the text, and that had already raised questions about the parameters of the will or what's voluntary in Aristotle. Galen also puzzles over the volition involved in urinating, breathing, and swallowing. At least some of these ambiguous movements had clustered under the problem of sympatheia qua contagious affect in the problems literature, where their problematic quality reflects that chain of affective transmission that involves the mind, but seems to sidestep decision and deliberation to trigger these near-automatic mimetic responses. So perhaps Galen is suggesting in unproblematic movements that eye disease can arise much as these affections do. If so, it wouldn't be that the diseased impressions don't matter, but like the mysterious seeds of disease that Galen references elsewhere, those impressions will matter less than the unstable affective life of a mimetic imaginative animal. 1400 years later, the problem of contagious affect recurred in the 16th century Galenist Francisco Valles, who was a close reader of Fracastoro in addition to Galen, and whose work on contagion and sympathy is cited by Nutton, whose work I draw on here. In a discussion from his Controversiae from 1556 that instrumentalizes his own theories of sympathy and antipathy, Valles allows for the sympathetic transmission of seeds of disease. But then he argues that some things only look like this kind of sympathy. So he says the phenomenon of contagious yawning is better explained through imagination, and the sympathy, here it's consensus, which is another Latin term used for translating sympathy between mind and body. So someone whose toothaches, when he looks at someone suffering toothache, had been made aware of a pain that was already there, but almost imperceptible. So here Valles will trade one kind of sympathy, not contagion between bodies, for another within the body. Nevertheless, his own navigation of contagious affect is a reminder that sympathy, far from being a monolithic pillar of pre-modern thought, had a long life as a way of making sense of contagious affect both inside and between living and sensing bodies within Greek traditions of naturalizing medicine, science, and philosophy. Thank you.